Hello everyone, welcome back. I know it's been a long time. I've been busy doing some other things, but today I want to share a quick video of how I weather intermodal containers. I know on the web there is not too many videos describing any methods, so through my trial and error methods, I sort of figured out what I wanted to do. So I want to take a minute here today, share that with you, and hope that helps you weather your intermodal fleet. To start, I usually head to the internet to railroadpicturesarchives.net to take a look and see some of the prototype photos that I could find. Today I'm doing two MSC 40-foot containers, and I found this from a quick search on that website. Taking a look at the top container today, which is going to be one of the 40-foot containers, we can see that it's going to have a little bit of a white fade along with rust on the edge and then a rust path on that right hand side there. And the second one we're going to take a look at is a little bit more faded, so we're going to do a little more of a white airbrush to that, and also you still got a little bit of rust down below here, but it's not as much on the left hand side and the corners of the container. So for everyone's background, I use a Posh XL airbrush. It's a double action where you can control both the pressure and also the flow of paint that will come out of it. And my regulator is set to 40 psi. I just use a Craftsman air compressor with a moisture trap on it, so I can also use it for home hardware projects. Now, to make the paint, I use both Anita's acrylics. I get this from Hobby Lobby, I think 99 cents for a small container like this, and 70% isopropyl alcohol. I'll mix this to a skim milk type consistency to allow the weathering to happen. So I will take you through the process of this. Another great thing I have is the small plastic Dixie cups that allow me to mix my paint in. Just a little bit of paint, followed by some IPA, whatever gives us that milk or skim milk consistency, and a small paintbrush here. I'll mix that around. I could say, and too, if you don't have an airbrush, it's not the end of the world. You can simply also just use weathering powders, which we will get to later on in this video. So taking a look, you can see it's like a skim milk type consistency. It's pretty thin, and I think that will do well for our application. We're going to load it here into the airbrush and do a couple test sprays. Now you will notice when we do this airbrushing method that the air compressor is going to kick on a couple times just because it's not a silent one. It's a regular air compressor. And going to our table here, I have a very cheap cake spinner. I like to use it so I don't have to put my hands on the models and get my fingerprints on them. I also tend to wear a glove just to minimize the amount of spray on my hands. Now for the containers, since they're so small, I use blue painter's tape on the bottom to hold them in place so they don't get blown away while I'm airbrushing. So since we just looked at those two pictures, one of them is going to be faded with white and the other one is going to be faded a little heavier with white, and we'll go. So for the method to do this, you want to start on the far left side of the container off it and spray horizontally across until you get to the other side. You want to go all the way off the model to make sure that you don't have extra buildup right here. And another thing to note is that since there's so many ribbed beams here, is that you have to get the model from all different angles to make sure the paint is very even. Now here is the finished product of doing the whitewash. You can tell the container in the front is weathered or washed to a much less degree as the container in the back. So the next step in this process is going to be to dull coat the models to prepare for the powder work that follows. Now, I don't do this down here in the basement just because the fumes are pretty nasty from spray paint. So I will go out into my garage and I will simply just take the whole tray with me and double coat the whole tray. Now I know there's a big discussion on what type of finishes and dull coats people use. I like this Krylon matte finish, item number 1311. I find it works just about is the same as a tester's and it costs a lot less. So back here after dull coating the models and comparing them to the pictures that we showed you earlier from online, these models just look a touch too white. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go use some burnt or earth brown Anita's acrylic with some isopropyl alcohol and create a very thin dirt wash to spray over both of these cars to fade down a little bit of that yellow white and give me more of a realistic color that I'm looking for. It's okay if you don't hit every single spot because in the real life prototype there's going to be spots that are cleaner than others, so this makes it more regular and more realistic. I need a little more here, maybe just a touch up to the top, a little dirtier one. This one has a spot more in the center. Like that, I think we're good. So we're going to dull coat that and we'll be back. So after dull coating the model, I moved ahead and finished the weathering by putting a little bit of acrylic paint, a touch of oil streaks, and some powders on the model. And here you can see the finished version. And this is the example of the more heavily weathered car. I'm not going to show you how I did this, but in the lighter weathered container version. So going back to the picture of the container we're going to weather together, we can see that there is a heavier rust streak headed down on the corner of the containers along each of the 8 corners. And we also have this little pattern of streaking going on that we also have to mimic. So we're going to get back to the workbench and I'll show you how we do that. To start the darker rust stains, I'm going to use Anita's acrylic earth brown and an Atlas 10-0 brush to get some of the darker rust spots around the corners and also down the sides. We're going to see that deeper dark rusty. Let me get my glove on just in case I have to touch the model. I'm only going to touch the top, but I'm going to try my best not to touch it at all. And I'm simply just going to use the cap of the paint container. I'm going to slowly paint on all around. It doesn't be too good because we're going to go through this with powders afterwards. So just a little bit where some of those darker rust spots are. So now that I got the darker rust patches on all 4 top corners and also the 4 bottom corners, it's time to put alongside little side swipes that create some rusty spots. And with that, I'm actually going to use oil paints because that creates a little more realistic effect in my opinion. So for oil paints, I use Winsor Newton Burnt Umber, and this is a water mixable oil. It's very easy to work with, so this is what I prefer. And what I'm going to do is take a little bit on my 10-0 Atlas brush and just barely dot it alongside the raised ribs to create that rust effect that we saw in the picture. Now with a flathead brush, sometimes I'll use the cheaper one or a little more expensive version, and some mineral spirits poured into a cup. I will get the brush nice and wet, damp it off here on a paper towel just on the left, make sure it's not dripping, and slowly slide down the model, creating these awesome rust streaks. And for this I'm going to have to lift the model up a little bit with my gloves. So what I'm going to do is just use one finger on the tippy top to do it as I try to minimize. And with that, the oil painting is done. You can see here I've created a little bit of a streaking effect to match the prototype, which I'll go in and use powders after we dull coat the model, and we'll blend it all together. The corners and the edges have been used acrylic earth brown to create a darker rust color, and then this is the other side of the model. So right now I'm going to go and dull coat the model once the oil paint dries, and we'll come back for the last little bit of powder work before we finish. So I moved the camera hoping that it's going to be easier to be able to see and that my hand isn't going to be in the way. But the next step of the process is going to be using Monroe powders, medium earth and dark earth, to finish the model and blend everything together. I use a couple of soft, smaller brushes and then also a very thin, little harder brush so I can get stuff in the correct location. So I'm hoping this angle works better, but since I already got the four corners with the more heavily dark earth weathering powder, I'm now going to move on to the lighter areas with the medium earth powder. So I'm going to get some on here. Now, the last step in the process is the trickiest, which is usually trying to get this here, these rust stains, a little more pronounced. And do that, I also use this thin brush again, and I'll just barely put it across. Try to get a little more color and definition on those. And then we'll use the blending brush to sort of wipe some of that away. And with one last round of dull coat, the models are finished now. As you can tell, they're not perfectly prototypical, but as long as you have a main prototype photograph that you follow, it tends to make sure that you don't overly weather your cars. And now this whole technique takes practice. I know I've ruined a few cars and containers trying to do this, but overall, I think it's a really good idea to make your layout look more realistic. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, and let me know if you'd like me continue doing these weathering videos.